So let's talk about money. How much does it really cost to live a decent lifestyle here in Medellin, Colombia? Now, Medellin tends to be one of the most expensive cities in Colombia, along with Cartagena, simply because it's very popular with tourists. It has great weather. Lots of people want to live here. And so there are cheaper cities here in Colombia like Manizales, Pereira, Cali, Santa Marta, even Bogota, the capital. And so if you're watching this and thinking, wow, this seems expensive, it doesn't seem right, there are cheaper places to live in Colombia if you want to live here. Now, second of all, this is based on my own personal experience. I've lived here for around 7 or 8 months. I am by no means an expert about living here in Colombia, but this is just my take on what I've experienced so far. So the main outgoings people will have is rent and accommodation. Now, this is an interesting one because there tends to be two separate prices for properties to rent here. There tends to be the local price, like the Colombian price, and there tends to be the gringo, like the tourist price. And what that mainly boils down to is if you're renting an apartment without furniture, so you already have your own furniture like washing machine, fridge, sofa, bed, that kind of thing, you will be paying the local price, which will be a lot cheaper in pesos compared to the gringo price. And if you are renting a property fully furnished, it has a fridge, freezer, washing machine, bed, sofas, all that kind of stuff, basically you'll be paying the gringo price because locals do not rent properties furnished here. So that is the main difference between accommodation here. And sometimes the difference can be absolutely huge. You can be paying twice as much rent for a furnished property compared to the same property unfurnished. So for example, a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom flat in a relatively nice area might cost you 2 million pesos per month if it's unfurnished, which is around 400 GBP or $500. And that same property could be 3 or 4 million pesos per month, which is around 600 or 800 pounds, almost up to 1,000 USD, simply because it is furnished, it has all the furniture in. And I have heard some crazy stories on some of the expat groups here about tourists paying 10 million pesos up to 15 million pesos per month, which is around 3,000 pounds per month in rent. And I'm guessing these are for fully furnished properties which maybe have 3 or 4 bedrooms. So given that rent is the biggest expense everyone has, you have to be careful when you're here in Medellin, Colombia. So that's the first point. Rent can be relatively high here if you're renting a nice property in an expensive part of the city, fully furnished, that maybe has 3 or 4 bedrooms, because you're just going to be paying a lot of rent per month. Or compared to a Colombian who'll be renting an unfurnished property, and that helps keep their rent payments down. It also goes without saying the most gringo parts of Medellin, like El Poblado, Laureles, places like this, will have way higher rents compared to places like Envigado or Belén or Sabaneta, Itagüí, places like this. So when I first moved to Colombia and I was renting a flat, I rented somewhere in Envigado, which is a lot cheaper compared to the same flat equivalent in El Poblado, and that helped me to keep costs down. Now, as a lot of you will already know, I've come from London, and so if you compare rent prices London versus Medellin, then obviously Medellin comes in at a lot cheaper. But that is partly due because London is one of the most expensive cities to rent and to buy in the world. So obviously when you're comparing basically any city to London, it's always going to be significantly cheaper. But if you want to live here, or you already do live here, you have to kind of think like a local, you have to think like a Colombian, and you have to forget about the New York or the London property prices. So yeah, the biggest cost everyone will have will be accommodation, and that is largely dependent whether you're renting a furnished property or an unfurnished property and where that property is. Now the second cost will be groceries. Now groceries on the whole are relatively cheap here in Medellin, Colombia, and in Colombia in general, simply because of the weather and the climate here. They basically grow everything. They don't really have to import too many things, and it means things like fruits, vegetables, meats are relatively cheap. The only thing that I can think of which are more expensive here in comparison to, let's say, the UK are apples. For some reason, apples are just really expensive here and they're not that good, but basically everything else is around 50% cheaper than it is in the UK, and so you will not have to worry about buying groceries or breaking the bank, buying nice healthy quality food here in Medellin, Colombia. Now the cheapest way to buy groceries is actually at the tienditas, in the small little shops you get dotted around the neighborhoods, and the more expensive way to shop is at the big supermarkets, and that's actually the opposite compared to the UK. In the UK, if you do your shopping at Sainsbury's, Tesco, that kind of thing, you're going to be spending far less compared to if you go to small little independent shops. But here in Colombia, it's the other way around. You want to do the vast majority of your grocery shopping at the tienditas, at the little small shops, and that will save you some pesitos. And when it comes to eating out, it really depends on where you're eating out and what type of restaurants you're eating out at. For example, if you are hitting up a local restaurant in your little neighborhood and you're having a menu del dia, right now in 2026 it's around 20,000 pesos for a menu del dia, which you normally get a serving of protein, vegetables, salad, sopita, like a little soup, some rice or potatoes, and a juice. So it's a pretty good meal for a lunch, and that will set you back around £4 or $5. So basically, if you're doing that most days, the cost is not really going to rack up that much. On the other hand, if you are going to fancy restaurants in Poblado Poblado, you're not having menú del dia, you're having more typical restaurant food that you get in Europe or the US. The cost can really rack up significantly, and some of the most exclusive restaurants here in Poblado, you could be paying London prices for those meals. So basically, if you're eating menú del dia every day, you'll be absolutely fine. You're not going to break the bank account. If you're going super exclusive, super nice, it will cost you significantly more. This is a mistake I think a lot of tourists make when they move over here. They try to live this luxury lifestyle, going to fancy restaurants all the time, and they simply just burn through their money at the end of the day. Now, travel is a really interesting one because Medellin does have a metro, but it runs through the middle of the city, meaning that if you live near a metro station, you can easily take it, and if your final destination is relatively near the center of the city as well, you're absolutely fine. You could take the metro there and back. But if you don't live near a metro station, or your destination is also not near a metro station, you'll have to take the metro and a taxi as well, which can add up in cost. There is a really good bus network here in Medellin where you can basically go to any place in the city, but for some reason a lot of tourists and foreigners do not like taking the bus because it tends to be, I don't know, just like frowned upon. Maybe people come here thinking they're going to have this really ultra exclusive luxury lifestyle and they never take the bus. Me personally, I do occasionally take the bus. I like it. It's a bit more fun. I feel like a local when I'm doing it. It saves massively on cost, and it's probably only going to take you a little bit longer than you would do if you were in a normal taxi. So a lot of tourists, even locals as well, will be taking Ubers. Now, the Uber price can change massively depending when you take the Uber in the day. Anytime from kind of 4 p.m. onwards up until 8 p.m. or 9 p.m, sometimes the surge charge on Ubers can be 2 times, sometimes even 3 times the normal price. Meaning that if you are using Uber a couple of times a day at peak hours, you could easily be spending 50,000 or 100,000 pesos per day, which is 10 to 20 pounds just on travel, which would be significantly more compared to if you were in London and just using the tube every day. So if you're not careful, you're doing that 5 or 6 times a week, you could be spending 100 pounds a week just on travel and Ubers. Using Uber motorbikes can massively reduce the cost of those Ubers, and also just being sensible of when you travel as well. And as you guys will tell from my last video, the traffic is really bad during those peak hours, so not only are you paying 2 or 3 times the price for your Uber, you'll also just be sat in traffic for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, just wasting time and money. So you have to be careful about when you travel here and what mode of transport you use. And I'll just give you one example about how I personally save a lot on costs here when I'm traveling. So a taxi from the city to the airport just outside Medellin is around 120 to 140,000 pesos, which is around 25 to 30 pounds, which for Colombia is really expensive. So what I do is I take an Uber from wherever I am to the station Exposiciones here in Medellin, then I take the bus, which literally takes the same time like it would do in a taxi, but the bus is 20,000 pesos, which is 4 pounds. So you can save yourself around 20 quid every time you go to and from the airport here just by taking a taxi to the bus stop and then taking the bus to the airport, which, given that they run every 15 minutes, is a way more efficient way of getting around and getting to the airport. And not a lot of tourists know about that little hack. I found out about it from my Spanish teacher. So basically, the moral of that story is you have to think more like a local here and not just like a completely blank canvas gringo. Otherwise, your cost of living here in Medellin will be relatively expensive. And in terms of going out at night, this is when the costs can really rack up. So a lot of tourists come to Medellin to party, to have a good time, to live this luxury lifestyle. But if you're going out most nights to Provenza and Parque Lleras, to some of the fancy places in El Poblado, you could be paying up to 60 or 70,000 pesos per drink, which is almost 15 pounds or almost 18 US dollars. And so if you're doing that, if you're going out with women, you're buying drinks for them, you're having a good time, you want to show off, you want to splash the cash, your bill for that night out could end up being in the hundreds of pounds. And so your Medellin lifestyle, along with your expensive furnished apartment in El Poblado, you're taking Ubers everywhere, you're going out a lot, you're not having your menú del dia, you're eating off the car in the fancy restaurants, you could be paying thousands of pounds per month. And unless you have a lot of money in the first place, that is not sustainable. And I think that is partly one of the reasons why a lot of people don't hang around for long in Medellin, Colombia, because they basically just run out of money simply because they're trying to live this luxury lifestyle they can't afford. Now, I only discovered Colombia in April 2024, so almost 2 years ago, but from what I understand from talking to my local Colombian friends is that the prices before the pandemic, before 2020, were significantly lower than they are now. And that's probably due to a number of factors which I'll probably touch on in another video. So for me, when I want to go out, which is not that often, I do tend to stay away from the super touristy areas. I tend to go on coffee dates during the day, hiking, things in nature, basically things that aren't going to cost me an absolute packet compared to if I was buying drinks in El Poblado and trying to impress women I'm on a date with fancy drinks, cocktails, etc. Even though as a gringo here, there there is the perception that you just have unlimited money and that you can go out in Provenza every single night for the rest of your life, which is obviously not true for the vast majority of people. And funnily enough, there are some things here in Colombia which are more expensive compared to the UK. Healthcare products, for example, supplements, because they are all imported goods and there are import tariffs, that kind of thing, they tend to be significantly more expensive. I remember a big bottle of contact lens solution in the UK in Boots. You could buy a half a litre bottle for £1, and here you buy a 75 milliliter bottle for £6, which is a crazy markup considering you are in Colombia. And things like health supplements as well, protein powder, creatine, all of that stuff is more expensive here. But by and large, things are a lot cheaper. And when it comes to extra costs, like taking your dog to the vet, to buying bedding, kind of stuff for the house, that all tends to be significantly cheaper. I have a dog, for example. She had a problem with her eye last year. She needed a surgery and she had the surgery here in Medellin. I think it would have cost 20 times the amount that it did here. So things like veterinary surgeries are significantly cheaper here. There we have it, guys. Living a nice life here in Medellin, Colombia can be cheap, but you basically have to think like a local. You can't just think like a gringo. You can't take Ubers everywhere. You can't be staying in penthouse apartments in Poblado, fully furnished forever. Unless you have extremely deep pockets, you will have to think a little bit more like a Colombian in order for you to capitalize on the cheaper cost of living here, basically. So I hope you guys found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.